They found the jar in a room that had not been opened for a generation, behind a door painted the same weary gray as the corridor, with its key wrapped in blackened thread and hidden among folded linen invoices. The air in that small vault of a space tasted of old lime and soap, with an undernote of cold iron and the mildew that creeps in when gaslight is out and the pipes sweat. It was the sort of air that keeps its own time, thick with minute threads of fluff that take the light, and float like thistledown beneath rafters that remember rain as a vibration more than a sound. He unscrewed the lid with care, reasoning as any county man would that nothing harmful could live in a jar so completely sealed, and the wet mineral reek that rose around his wrist was not quite tar, not quite vinegar, not quite the flat, bloodless smell of iron filings left wet too long. Inside, preserved in a fatty shine, lay a coil of coarse black hair and a nest of square-cut nails like the ones hammered into sleepers before the rails came heavy into these hills, small and handmade, each with its blunt, shiny face. At the bottom there was a tooth, a child's first molar, the edges lacquered in pitch, and a card in a hand that could have belonged to any superintendent. Weaver, T. Retain for reference, avoid drafts. He did not know the name then, not in any personal way, but when his fingers lifted the card, hair rose on his forearms as if a cool breath had entered the room. He swore later that even with the window bricked and the wires to Weston Depot cut for 2 decades, he heard a sound, like a wire singing in winter wind, thin and constant, coming up from the floor rather than down from any rafters. There are sensible ways to tell the story of such a jar, such a sound, and they involve the settling of old boards, the hiss of a leak in a gas pipe, the mind's quickness to furnish explanation when it rubs against the rough edge of something it cannot place. But there was water running in the pipes that day, only far off in the women's ward, and the sound in that windowless linen room continued for as long as the lid sat unthreaded on the table, unbroken as a held breath, fading to nothing the moment. The jar was sealed again and the wax cooled under his thumb. One wonders why a hospital, even in days when physicians kept their own cabinets like curiosity shops, would keep a child's hair and a nest of tempered nails submerged in pitch and spirits. Why the label warned against drafts, as one might warn, against a flame near ether, and why the sound, if there was a sound, seemed to travel through timber and nail more than air and ear. It is a small thing, a jar on a floor that would soon be swept and sorted and the items within packed off, anonymized, to the county archive or the river, but the man who put it back on the shelf did so with 2 hands, and when he closed the doctor and turned the stiff key, he found himself listening to the seam of the wall as if it might answer him. The year that jar was first filled is recorded elsewhere in a different hand, in a ledger that has lost its leather but kept its numbers. 1874, the line across the page picking up the new year as if crossing a plank over a ditch. In those months, the C&O pushed its iron spine down toward the Ohio, and the turnpikes bore cavalry not at a gallop, but with account books and the lists of men and length of spade. And Weston, with its river curving slow and brown around the grounds, received more visitors of a certain kind than it wished to count. The asylum then was still called the Hospital for the Insane, though townspeople who worked in the kitchen or on the farm said the old words because old words have a steadier feel in the mouth, and the building stood like a made thing pretending to grow from the soil, long wings laid out under the Kirkbride ideal that light and air might heal the mind that had turned in on itself. The stone was cool even at noon, cool in the corridors where boots scuffed. A constant cool made of thickness and groundwater, and within those walls came a child born in a cart the family had used to haul salt pork to market and now used for a boy who no longer walked. Thomas Weaver, his family name unremarkable among millers, rope hands, and salt men, came inland from Nicholas County by way of muddy traces and a river crossing, and the springs that fed the Gauley had been cold when he was born and were colder now. his father, who had worked the saltpeter caves when such work could be had, climbing like a window washer down into gut-dark tar-smelling earth to scrape the white crust of niter from the walls and leach it with lye, broke his back under stone. 2 winters earlier, and left his wife a dresser half full of rough shirts, a pair of boots with the heel worn to the quick of the nail, and a boy who put his ear to the floor and would not lift it even when the iron stove hissed and the house smelled of hot yam. Thomas had been solemn as a broodcock before the accident and quieter after, thin, always with dirt in his fingernails from seeking through boards and chests for some small piece of iron to palm and hold between his molars as if it might teach him a prayer. And as the months turned and the church bell was fixed again at St. Matthew's, he took to crying without sound at each chime until it felt to his mother a mercy to stop the bell with a stick and a nail for as long as the sexton would allow. The women who came by to advised what women advise when men are gone. Wet sheet packs to bring down feverishness, a soft shoe by the hearth to hold a coal at night so a boy could put his feet on it and feel the day coming, and laudanum. The men, when pressed, suggested a doctor, though in the same breath spoke of the boy in the mill who heard the river below the ice and ran for the road when the cry of it turned high. West Virginia, then, was a state only a little older than the boy himself. Raw cut from the body of a war, a new skin over old roads and older ground, and those who took him into the hospital, writing his age and particulars with pen scratch, and Sand noticed at once that he kept 2 fingers of his right hand on the doorframe and would not move them until a wagon on the road outside had passed, as if he had to feel the weight of it through stone and nail before he could trust the floor. Again. The ground had its own history before the boy set his cheek to it, a history more patient than any of our small list-making. The hospital rose on land that had been farm and flood, with a temporary camp hospital before that, the tents and rough sheds of men with kits split open, the smell of boiled linen and carbolic mingled with liverish odors of mules and the sweet sour of grass underfoot. Everywhere there are such layers, but in those years they were fresh enough to seep up in rain, and the masons, setting their last stones in '64, heard the all-night rumble of supply and those sharp cracklings of telegraph. Messages sent along the turnpike to Clarksburg and on west. The weavers of rope and sacks for salt on the Kanawha spoke of the caves as if they were a separate county, a place where words came back different, and a man learned to gauge damp by taste, and the boy's father, who had gone down often with a cheap lantern and an old gunny sack, always came home smelling of vinegar and bat, and that other odor that rides in caves like a second breath. Faintly metallic, the smell of iron praying to be iron. When he died, it was a small caving of an undercut seam, the sort of shift that proper timbering would have prevented, but the men were working without the timber because money had gone thin with the panic after '73, and his body was pinned and not fetched in one piece, a boot gone missing, and the tongues of rumor beginning their work. People who had not gone underground said there was a muffled sound in those caves, not the rushing of the river, but something that sat in a note that was neither low nor high, somewhere where one feels it in the tongue and teeth more than hears it in the head. And a woman who watered down her milk and told herself it was for charity said that it pressed on her mouth until she swallowed and could not swallow enough. There were stories then, spread by men who had come home with ash in their whiskers and wanted to sit and make a thing out of talk, about tongues cut from deserters and buried under lintels to keep houses quiet, of bodies carried along the old salt road and stacked in a cave when frost was in the branches. But stories are a kind of weather, and they settle where they are wanted. It is enough to notice that the hospital had been built partly by those who would later walk its halls in gowns, an economy of sorrow that looks efficient on paper. It is enough to notice that ironwork was everywhere then, rails in bundled sections stored in churchyards, straps cut from kegs and scattered by boys into streams to see if they would swim, and nails, square, rough, bent, saved in cigar boxes, and used twice, 3 times, 4, if they could be straightened. The ground was learning a new metal, and the rooms were learning to hold a new tone. The boy's extraordinary complaint began small and grew inwards, as such things do when they are noticed too late and then noticed too well. He could not abide the bell nor the thudding feet across the boards, and soon he could not abide the places where gravel had been tamped hard into the roadbed, which his mother took for nerves, until she saw that he put his palm to the earth and breathed easier in hollows where the small stones were loose and voiceless. Men who knew something of wires, which is to say they had seen them and pulled at them when boys and been shocked by a dry winter kiss with a stove, said that the operators in Clarksburg kept the key clicking day and night now that commerce had resumed, and in August of '74, with storms moving up the valley like bishops in a careful game, the wires sang so the horses put their ears back and would not face them straight on. There is no mystery in a wire that hums in rain, nor in a child whose attention is caught by a constant sound or by the thought of it. But there was something else in Thomas which his mother could not call a thought or a sound. He began to line up iron bits under his pillow as if to wait himself to sleep, when the wind raised its thin cry against the window, and when the neighbor's boy swung his telegraph kit in mockery, the cheap sounder striking down with a toys. Authority? The child stood up from where he had been lying on the hearthstones and turned as if he were a stone pulled by a magnet, though no circuit was made and no key was pressed. He imagined there were lines under the house and traced them in charcoal on the floor until his mother scrubbed the boards with salt water, only to find the lines had migrated to the underside of the bed slats and the low rafters of the loft, always pointing to the same place behind the mill where the new crossbars stood black against the sky. When he could not stop his jaw from trembling, he thumbed the nails he kept in his pocket with a kind of devotion and put one in his mouth, letting it sit heavy on the tongue until his gums bled and chapped and took on a metallic taste that made his breath smell like women say coins smell when held in the palm too long. The doctor they brought was a decent man who had lost 2 sons to spring cholera and who distrusted spectacles of any kind, and he said the boy had the nerves and prescribed what doctors prescribe in years when cause is fog and effect a tide: tinctures to rub into the temples at night, soft compresses, a spell outdoors. There are effects of the iron road that can be measured, and the tremor that reaches into a house from the passage of a heavy freight is one of them. But there are also effects that belong only to the imagination, which is not to say they do not work on the body. His breathing shortened when the far-off drill began, and he lay on the floor with his face to the plank and his mouth open as if the wood were a window for air. When he began to sleep only in the spring house with his ear to the stone and his hand in the cold water, his mother, who had lost enough already, let the men bring the cart and did not watch as it went away. The doctors took him in under the plane. Rules of the place, which require little more than a statement from the county and a signature, and they set out to measure what could be measured in a long room with tall windows and a table scarred by other instruments. They had the machines of the day, polished when guests came to see the triumph of rational craft over fear. A static machine that gave off a sweet ozone smell like rain in cast-iron pipes. A battery that breathed when it was working and left. A faint warmth under the hand. A galvanometer whose needle saw more movement in a week than a man sees in a year. Their air was full of the hiss of gas, the breath of lab assistants in quiet discipline, and in that air, the boy seemed both quieter and more attentive, as if the order soothed him even while the metallic taste of it thickened his saliva. They pasted electrodes to the thin skin of his forearm and his brow and watched the needle rest, then stir, not with the touch, but before it, trembling a hair's width when the operator only reached toward the key and lay still when the key fell. The wires went across the floor like roots, and he kept pulling his toes back from them, not wanting to step across certain places where the rubber insulation had cracked or thinned. It was a child's superstition, perhaps, but it duplicated something the assistant had observed, that laid wires throw shadow seams into a room that the unwary trip on. They brought a key on a table from the depot, its brass unpolished and honest, and the operator sat far from the battery and did nothing but lay his fingers on the plate and lift them again as if he were praying in a creed he could not remember. The boy began to murmur numbers under his breath, not words, but a recitation that fell into even patterns. The sort of thing a mind does when it wants not to be the mind it is. And when a nurse who had a cousin at the Morgantown station wrote down the digits and the times and the gestures and sent them up, the cousin wrote back that what the boy said were not words in any language, but the sequence was the same as the one used to test the wire without sending a message, a little dance of contact that men keep up by habit rather than need. All this could be coincidence, and the doctors wrote it down as faintly suggestive and no more, and for a good hour afterward they did nothing, content with a question that seemed answerable by steady attention. Then a storm entered the valley, and before the rain touched the windows, there came a low pressure that dimmed the lamps and made men look at their knuckles as if at a remembered injury. And in that emptiness the boy sat up, though his wrists were tied with a cushiony cloth to keep him from rising too fast and falling, and he turned his head toward the floor, not the window nor the roof, and there was a sound like a taut string tightening, the wire learning a new song as it wetted. At night, when the wards were quiet enough that a cough seemed indecent, they put him in a room where one wall had been covered in tin sheets from the kitchen, hammered flat and riveted where a seam insisted on opening. A room not truly closed to the world, but closed to the quick changes of air that made him shake. The tin smelled like it had come from sardines because it had, and where the men had handled the sheets with their grease-blackened hands, prints remained as if another world had been pressed into this one. There is no magic in a lined room, only quieter drafts and a sense of enclosure that some find soothing and others find intolerable. But the boy slept there with his mouth open and a string of drool cooling in the early hours. And when he woke, it was as men wake who have been long at sea and find themselves on land, surprised and slower in their movements. He had scratched a single word into the plank near the wall before they moved him, and when the matron, who believed in clean floors as a bulwark against chaos, bent to clean it, she saw it was not the word she had expected from boys who had been in other rooms, not the word that scandalizes a board and is then laughed at, but a smaller word that one writes when one has lost hope of another. Under, pressed into the grain as if the knife had been carried by a heavy hand. They had noticed a warm patch before in the corridor outside, a place where it was more comfortable to stand in winter draft, and the porter was sent, cursing his knees, to lift the boards, and he found not dry dirt, but a culvert built when the place had been a supply depot full of the trash of hospitals, bottles with their corks flaking into dust, bundles of cloth that had held lint and were now holding mice, and a thin line of water, not enough to call a leak and not little enough to be forgotten. In the corner, where the bricks sagged and the mortar looked as if it had sweated, there was a small encrustation the color of blood rust and the shape of a child's ear, which is a coincidence to a geologist and a sign to a nurse. And when they brought it up, it left a dark ring on the plank which, no matter how scrubbed, always reappeared on wet days. The operator from the depot, who had more curiosity than his wife liked and came by any time there was an excuse, set his hand on the wall near the warm place and said later that it felt like a cat purring on the other side, though he would not be drawn to say he believed in such things. All the while the boy lay on his cot with his jaw unclenched, and the sound, if one had the misfortune to listen for it, seemed to have tucked itself into the joists where the nails lived, rather than in the air that men trusted. They did what institutions do when something begins to touch the edges of their order. They doubled down on the ordinary. They put him on the hydrotherapy as if it were a mountain ritual, packing him in heavy sheets taken cold from the cistern and then warmed at his chest by the heat that the body gives off even when the mind is elsewhere. The water on the sheets smelled of lime and river, and as it dried, the sheet took to his skin like a second skin, both soothing and asserting itself. and he slept under it, breath slow and a kind of leaking grace in the early morning. For a day or two, the nurses congratulated one another in the small ways available to those without votes in the rooms where votes mattered, saying that what the body could not hear would not hurt it, and the boy, who had a habit of chewing in his sleep, lay slack-jawed, the taste of pitch and old metal washing away. In the next room, the iron beds with their long spines began to answer the evening wind, giving off a tone like a spoon on a jar, but stretched thin until it drifted out of hearing and only remained in the jaw and the temple, a tenacious grip, rather than a sensation. The women who prided themselves on indifference found their hands shaking when they lit the lamps and had to steady the matches as if they were skittish horses. The orderly with the perfect handwriting grew a nosebleed that left brown dots on his ledger, which he blotted and never mentioned. The matron had a dream of nails being pushed up through the soles of her feet and woke to find a tack in her slipper that she knows she had not left there. A porter was discovered late one evening sitting under the roller in the laundry as if waiting to be pressed. Not hurt, only dumbstruck. Within his pocket, a little spiral made of nails and wire that he swore he had found already made. Though, the wire was from a crate opened that morning, and he had the knuckled look of a man who had been twisting metal while thinking of nothing. It is not a nonsense to notice that moods spread in a closed building as smells do, and moods then were turning sour and quick like milk near the stove. They took the boy down to the coal cellar on a day when ice gripped the river edges and set him on a pallet there, thinking perhaps that stone under the earth and fire close by would do what tin and sheets could not. And he took a piece of burned wood and drew a map with his left hand while his right lay still at his side. A map of corridors and drains and little rooms that had been bricked. A map that had a grace to it and a scale, as if to say not only where things were, but how they pressed on one another. Later, when the river came up in spring and found the old cuts it had known before the hospital, the water moved along those lines as if following a memory, and men said maps are maps whether drawn by plan or by hand in the dark. When the telegraph lines came down in a storm that skated the ridge with ice and pulled black down out of the sky so the world seemed to have been gridded and then erased, the hospital found itself abruptly in a silence that felt like a held breath after a scream. The boy, who had been thrumming like a plucked string in his palate for days, lay quiet, as if some knot had been untied inside him, and for a morning the women came and went with their basins and their quiet footsteps, and found themselves humming and did not know when they had begun. In the hollow by the turnpike, days later, when the sun had come back and clouds lay like sheep on the hills, two children hunting for their own echoes came upon a boot with the sole half-rotted and a nail hammered into it sideways. The nails, old iron bright where it had been protected and rusted elsewhere, and in the toe of that boot was hair and some straw and something like a concretion of dark matter no one could name. The deputy who fished it up with a stick threw the stick away and did not want to carry the boot, but he did, out of a sense that a thing found is a thing given, and he set it on the stoop of the hospital because there was no other county building. With a door as heavy, and the matron, whose hands had been steadying for years, took it inside and did not mention it to the superintendent. The wires went back up, and the depot operator taught new boys to listen with their fingers instead of their ears as if nothing had altered. But the men who slept above the linen room would not hang their boots on nails at the bedfoot any longer, preferring to lay them on the floor, and the man in 1931 who found the jar and then put it back would, in a way he could not justify, do the same for the rest of his life. The hospital added a line to a book that spring that recorded the boiler's repair and the paint ordering and the death of a woman whose name only the men in the cemetery now remember. There was no line that recorded that a child's face had relaxed into what might be called contentment when the wire was quiet and tightened again when it sang. If one is inclined to charity, one can say they were busy. If one is inclined to understanding, one might kneel and put a palm to the floor at the edge of the ward and feel, very faintly, something like a cat's throaty purr caught not in flesh, but in stone. On certain nights that winter, when the dogs in town turned their faces toward the hill and showed their teeth without a sound, a small beat could be felt in the iron railing at the foot of the hospital's main stair, a delicate stammer one would miss if one were not leaning there with a ledger pressed to one side. The gas jets hissed and the heat rose, and out in the yard, the water left overnight in the tubs froze with a skin that had the sheen of lead. But the railing remembered something else, some far-off insistence that lined itself up with the rhythm of the operator's hand in the Weston Depot, and then, in a hush too tight to be named, slipped a beat ahead. A nurse carrying a basin of starch paused because the water made a small ticking against the enamel, as if someone had thrown pebbles into it, and the starch smelled sharp, like boiled linen hung above a slaughterhouse drain. And there was a sensation in her teeth as of a string pulled over the ridge of a rough nail. In the laundry, a man spreading damp sheets thought he heard weeping under the thump of the mangle, but when he bent toward the rollers, there came only a breath of carbolic and old soap like the sea gone sour. The boy slept in the room lined with kitchen tin. There were finger marks at two heights on that tin now, one set as any boy would make and the other higher, as if someone had tried to steady herself in bad news. And his mouth had fallen open, and the small spot of spit that drew down from the corner curved not straight, but in a slight arc as if drawn toward the wall. On his palate, his hand lay palm up with the fingers curled, and under the nails the black of soot looked like soil until one noticed the tiny sparkles, the iron filings that find a home in places one touches often against one's better habit. Far below him, in the culvert, the porter had opened at the matron's request. A thin line of water, not more than 100 needle thread, began to move against a rust rash on brick and carried a hair, coarse and black, until it caught and shivered. There, without letting go, a night watch passed that place as he always did, and would have walked on without looking down if the air had not for a moment felt like an empty bell. And when he put his hand to the brick to steady himself, the warmth of it did not come from the boiler that labored night and day, but from a quiet that had weight. There was nothing to tell but the day's work and the small variations of weather. There was only the particular feeling that the building was now not only holding its people, but also listening with them. In the new year, they resolved to make a record of the boy that would satisfy both the physician's conscience and the board's temper. And they did so with the sober efficiency of men who know the difference between curiosity and care. The hospital then had a superintendent who kept a clean desk and a temper that went quiet when others flared, and he approved the arrangement of a small room in the east wing where the boy could be seen without disturbance, and a table could be properly cleared of comforts and contraptions between use. The men in the depot had promised not to run their wire testing drills during certain hours, and the operator, who read men's faces as if they were messages sent at midnight in a storm, said he would do his best until the division office required otherwise. There is a certain look a place takes on when an experiment is to be made there. One sees the brushes lined like toothbrushes scrubbed clean and set bristle down in a row, the bottles shifted so the labels face like schoolboys during recitation, and the chairs pushed back as if they had all taken one small step and then been told to be still. And that room had that look. A small dignity in tools, and an invitation to leave them in peace. The boy was lighter than his years would have told you, and the notebooks taken up by the doctors became only some other set of hands around his body, and when they tied his wrist with soft cloth, it was not to keep him against his will, but to remind his elbow where it was. He had a slight smell about him now, that one smells sometimes on men who work with battery jars, a fugitive sweetness like a bruised apple kept too long near a coal scuttle. And when the assistant brushed the hair back from his forehead, she found a streak of black where the boy had put his finger to a stove bolt and then to his brow. They were decent in their attentions, calling fluid spirit, as was proper, and touching the skin around the electrode with clean fingers before allowing the paste to do its work. And the boy, when the room had attained a certain order, seemed to breathe from the floor rather than from the air. The town around them scraped by through a winter of scant money and heavy wood, men trudging with shoulders set and a way of speaking through their teeth in the wind, and the hospital did what all houses do then. It served bowls of hot thatch-colored soup. It mended socks. It turned its mattresses and kept its windows as tight as habit and old sash would allow. In there, as in every such place in those decades, there was a sense that the minds of men and the devices that served messages were not so far apart that sight and touch could be relied upon to mark their boundary with a pen stroke. The wires themselves were not the property of the hospital. They passed the hill as a traveler passes a farmhouse and later remembers the smell of bread without naming the house. The line on the ridge had been the army's once and was now the railways and the counties and the glassworks in odd hours. And when the men spliced and looped and tacked it to the pegs on the high crossbars, children in boots watched, from below with their heads thrown back in a manner of counting without numbers. That line had its history like any tool that sees more than one use, having listened in its quiet fashion to lists made out of hunger, to the deaths of men called for by name, to the price of salt, the sacks gone missing from a canal boat held by ice, and later to the appointment of a physician who kept his hat longer on his head than the board wished. The rail delivered new batteries up from the Ohio with wood shavings still in the crates, and the glass sweating when it was set inside a warm room, and the hospital bought old ones cheap, cleaned them, and made their own small business of current. For the surgeries that needed light, and the rooms that had to be heated when the coal came late. The men who understood those things in their hands did not all understand the world beyond it, but they knew enough to thread their bars with rubber where a wire might press, and they knew to lift a door rather than scrape it when the hinge had swollen, because the house would tell you if you listened how it wanted to be moved through. The boy lived in this, not above it or aside from it, and when one of the young doctors, a man with an eager stoop, spoke of Faraday and Galvani and that German who had shown that nerves were a kind of wire, his voice fell away in the tin room as if he had raised dust rather than meaning. To the women who mended, they were all wires already, the veins worming blue along a temple, the threads that held a seam, the lines of laundry hung to steam in the warm, wet rooms, the iron rods behind the plaster in the corridors where a hand could be laid and feel it reply faintly, as if someone below had turned over in his bed and would not be drawn into conversation. They had seen the aftermath of military hurry and had taken their children to the hill to watch the last supply wagons creak down toward the river, and though they did not speak of it often, they had heard the way the wires held an evening still until the last message had passed and then let it go. If the boy had a talent beyond sickness, it lived not in numbers or the names of things, but in a grammar of pressure and release that found hospitality in all the iron around him. Once the lines were restored after the storm and the operator resumed, his quiet habits like a priest coming back to a church where he keeps his own key, the boy grew restless again, and his tongue worked in his mouth as if he had found a kernel of grain and was trying to urge it toward his molars. The doctors thought it wise to limit his access to bits of scrap, and the matron, who could find a loose nail with her bare foot from across the room, took away the few he had gleaned from the window casement and the cracks around the door. Still, a day later there were 3 square-cut nails on the sill, each pointing toward the same corner of the room, like the hands of a clock ordered to be cautious. Nails working out of old boards is not a marvel, not in a house that has warmed and cooled and breathed for a decade, but these had not come straight up. They had made a little corkscrew of it, and their heads, which should have been rough with old hammerings, were polished as if by tongue or sleeve. In the ward, beds sometimes sounded when the women shifted at dawn and the frame took a sigh. But now the frames held a pitch that rode under the day's noise, a bright, narrow sound that was neither comfort nor complaint, and could be felt best by touching the upright rail near the foot with the back of the hand. On the 3rd day, a string of hair was found not on the boy's pillow, which would have been expected and ordinary, but braided around the small central spindle of the key they had borrowed from the depot. the kind of braid that takes patience, and time and two free hands, and the assistant who saw it first felt a swelling in her throat as if she had swallowed iron filings and they were asking for water. A child's tooth, that business of the mouth that belongs alternately to mothers, to barbers, and to God, had begun to trouble him. A first molar that had never quite come right, and which now, with the boy worn thin and worrying metal as if it were bread, bled at the margin, wept and smelled faintly of old smoke. The young doctor did what thousands had done and would do. He pulled it with a firm hand, using a little twist at the end to break the stubborn cord and catching the blood in his own handkerchief and putting the tooth in his waistcoat pocket. With a mixture of pride and the ordinary pity we feel when we have taken something small and necessary from another. That is an intelligible kindness. The disturbing thing came after when the matron, having been told by a kitchen woman that there was a way to draw a harm off a child by giving it a home elsewhere, asked the doctor for the tooth and, without offering a reason beyond the housekeeper's need to keep what is taken in a place where it will not be lost, received it into her closed palm. He watched her go, not with suspicion, but with the weary grace of a man who knows that a house is run by the things he does not see most as by what he does. And he felt the tooth small in his imagination, as if he still had it in his pocket and it had grown warm there. On the shelf in the back room where surgical thread was kept in greased packets and needles gleamed like fish bones in shallow tin, she set out an empty jar that had once held preserved peaches, scrubbed and scalded and rinsed with spirits until it kept only the ghost of summer. The porter brought pitch from the shop in a small lump, dark as a window at new moon and smelling of a kind of sharpened sweetness, and she softened it over steam until it moved like the yolk of an old egg, and then, with movements that were neither prayer nor experiment and yet contained something of both, she slicked the bottom of the jar with it. Into that she put a coil of the boy's hair, cut clean near the scalp and tied in a small loop, and 3 nails because 3 was the number she knew from candles and kitchen chores, and then the tooth because the body asks to be kept whole, even when it cannot be. And she poured over it the spirits left from cleaning, the kind that smell of a thunderstorm in iron piping. She did not write any word that would give away anything of her small superstition to anyone who came into that room with dispensation to judge. She wrote what the hospital would require, the boy's family name, an initial, a date in small numerals. That looked like the legs of running insects, and a note to avoid drafts, because she had learned in 100 kitchens that drafts change how a thing sets. The seal took a long time to cool, and there was that to do which must always be done, and the jar sat while the house lived around it. And when she came back, the room smelled faintly of pitch and iron and steam and the little warmed sweetness of spirits that have given up their vigor to another thing. She lifted the jar, and it made the sound any glass makes when you handle it, the faint chime that belongs to every human house, but under it there was a thin continuance, a kind of held line one hears sometimes in the telephone quality of a shell or a kettle and thinks nothing of until it submits to attention and refuses to go. She set it down. And that quiet thread continued as long as the lid felt the changing temperature of the room and ceased exactly when the wax, now hardening, accepted its permanence again. It was enough to incline her toward the thought that a thing that holds a piece of a person can be a place to leave a trouble, and enough to make her write that extra line with a firmness that carried a woman's mild defiance through the years. Avoid drafts, which was advice as much to herself as to the next hand that would reach up there. When the storm of that March scraped the ridge with ice like sugar dripped and hardened, and the lines went black and crackled into silence, the hospital received its ordinary quota of injuries and small tragedies, and did not anticipate trouble beyond the kind the weather has always brought. A horse shied at a sudden hiss from a downed wire and put a woman in the ditch with a twisted knee, and a boy came walking backward along the turnpike because in that posture the wind did not make his eyes water so much, and the operator in the Depew burned his finger when the loose end he had been testing snapped to the stove leg on the table. In the east wing, the lamps burned steadier for not having their flame disturbed by messages, as a lake smooths under a steady sky. And the boy lay on his pallet in the tin room and slept a deep sleep of exhausted adults rather than of children. When the lines were made whole and the first testing runs went through, the sound, if it can be called sound, came back into the iron of the bed frames and the door latches and the grate in the floor. It reassembled itself from materials already present, and it made men cross the room obliquely, avoiding certain places the way one avoids a soft spot on a plank by stepping on the nail heads instead. The porter, a man who had always kept his hands clean when he could and his mouth as shut as was healthful, was found in the laundry at the end of his shift with a lip bloodied and his breath smelling ferrous as if he had been trimming lambs, with bad shears and had cut his own finger and held it in his mouth. In his pocket was a nail whose head bore the print of a molar so small and sharp it could only have been made by someone else. No one accused him because accusation belongs to a kind of authority that the hospital understood how to withhold from itself when it had to. They watched him, and they watched the boy. And they watched the places in the floor where men had put their hands without knowing why. The doctors, who believed in structure and history, and the steady accretion by which a hypothesis is made respectable, opened the bricked-off room that the boy's map had described and found within a drum of insulated wire from the armies. Hasty occupation years, the gutta-percha gone to a kind of dry rot at the edges where the rats had tested it, and the interior bright where no hand had touched. It was just a spool. It was only a tool. And yet the rim was notched once with the neatness of a man who cuts himself a measure when he needs it, and next to it a letter that could have been an initial or a tally was cut again with the same neat hand. Nobody said the letter stood for the boy's name because no one in that place prized coincidence highly enough to do the damage that belief would have done. It was enough to note that the room had held something like a little heart of the thing the boy could not make his bones be indifferent to. By the time wages fell farther and men in the yards along the B&O took the bold step of stopping their hands in the summer of '77, the hospital had learned to look at the boy without looking long. They had learned to move him as one moves a cage with a songbird through a parlor where a piano is being tuned. The wires all over the region filled with instruction, hesitation, and anger in that season. And if there were men who said that a tone lived under everything that was not the earth itself, then those men heard that tone find a different key in those days and ride it like a horse. In the kitchen, news came without papers, and the women who had not thought themselves drawn into anything beyond their own discipline of patience and hot water found their arms prickling when the key downtown started its long clatter in the dark and would not stop. And they would set their knives down on the table and touch the blade lightly with the pads of their fingers as if to reassure themselves that steel belonged to their own uses too. In the ward, a quiet woman pushed her bed gradually, an inch a night, to the corner where the pearl of iron in the building's bones was least insistent, a movement she did not confess because confession requires that one have done a thing for a reason, and she had only done it for a sensation. The scrape on the floor told her nurse what she needed to know. The boy sometimes lay with his arm dangling off the pallet, and when he did, he would lift his fingers one by one with the solemnity of a man taking oaths and let them fall again until the moment when, as if the building had slightly shifted in a direction he understood, he would close his hand and be still. There were numbers again under his breath, some that matched the training run patterns the depot men used to check a wire, and some that belonged to another habit, the habit of men numbering to remember, not to count. The jar in the back room had acquired a ring around its base that came and went with humidity, a pale dampness that sometimes beaded like sweat. When the depot key hammered hard, the moisture gathered, and when the wires rested, it drew back and left a shining trace that took a long time to fade. The matron noticed this in the manner of a woman who notices the hand of the clock in relation to the shadow on the floor and says nothing but keeps it in the same place in her mind where she keeps recipes, the milk deliveries, and who has died and has not yet been entered in the book. At some point, the boy's tooth, which had lain quiet as stones lie when you take them from a river and set them on a table, began to show a detail that no one had recollected before, and that may have always been there. A small, darkened fissure running inward as if carrying with it the liquid of a long winter's sweet tea. A tract discolored the way bones in a pot sometimes are after a long stew. The young doctor, who learned not to touch things that belonged to others unless the touching had been made his business, said nothing, but he pressed his thumb against the glass and found it warmer by a shade than the shelf to either side. And when he lifted and turned the jar, so gently as to keep his own breath from fogging the glass, the tooth rolled a fraction of a turn, as if reminding the world it was meant to move. The label did what labels do when water and oil take an interest in them. It puckered slightly, and the curl at the corner that comes before illegibility made its small, threatening appearance, and then thought better of it, as if the room had not given it permission to forget. There were no phenomena that could be shown. As a list to anyone who demanded one, only a series of moments in which an object that does not make a habit of telling its mind looked very gently like a thing that thought. In the depot, the operator taught the new boys to lay 2 fingers on the plate to rest themselves when a run was long and to lift their eyes to the far wall when someone came in angry, because the wall will take anger as a river takes silt. And those boys, if they had business with the hospital after, would sometimes glance to the wall there too and feel it. Briefly, lift them. The matron, who had taken a lock of the boy's hair not for keepsake, but to give his mother something to hold if ever she had to carry away a thing empty of breath, looked in at him as she had every night since he arrived, and found that the line he had scratched in the old room once, the simple word for below, had returned as a faint stain in this room too. Not scratched, for the boards had a clean finish here, and a man would have had to include the mark in his estimate, but shown, as oil shows in wood if oil has ever been in it. He became a kind of instrument the building learned to read without making a ceremony of it. When the operator's key paused for longer than it should, the boy, even asleep, would lift his left hand once and settle it again, and when the wire carried bad news, his breathing would come quick and then thin, as a man does when he has received overmuch praise and wants only to be in a quieter yard. The superintendent disliked using the boy as a measure and wrote it in his notes as distaste plainly, but he had no choice in certain matters because the house itself seemed to step differently when the wire bore a heavy burden, and it was a simpler thing to ask the assistant to look in on the boy than to ask the depot for its secrets. People who came to the hospital for their ordinary reasons, to see a cousin or to have a tooth handled, learned nothing of this, because the rooms held themselves with a particular decency in the presence of strangers. If anything, the house looked more aged in the old-fashioned way on those days. Dust that had been settled rose straight as if each mote had been given leave. Down below, after a long rain, the culvert filled and ran slow and warm as a vein in spring, and the brick's rust bloom looked less like a small ear and more like nothing at all, and the porter, who had seen enough country funerals to know the difference between his job and a pastor's, kept the place clean without letting himself attach a single thought to any of it that would make him ashamed later. One man, a harmless man who washed the lamps and carried ledgers, was found one late afternoon in the little room off the ward where chairs were kept for visitors, with his ear pressed to the baseboard, his eye closed as if against an insult. And when the matron touched his shoulder, he sat up and smiled with apology, and blood went down in a string from his nostril onto his lip, as if his body had suddenly remembered that it had to be of this earth. He said nothing that could be written down that did not small itself in the telling. He only found a basin and bent, and let the blood go where the nurses would expect it to go, because that, too, was a way of keeping a house obedient to its own rules. It is at this point that a certain falseness enters such accounts, and it does so because the world demands a moment when the strange shows itself so clearly that even a cautious man must nod. This world rarely obliges with moments, but grants us rather a long braid of smaller perceptions that thicken until they might as well be rope. There was no night when Thomas Weaver stood up and declared himself instrument and judge, and there was no day when the hospital announced that it would shape its work around the sensibilities of a child. There was instead a season when the room's stillness felt more tender, and the drafts seemed to have learned to go around certain corners, the way cats learn not to leap onto a shelf where a woman keeps her best plates. If men had asked then whether the boy heard messages that men had not yet sent, the matron could not have answered, but she might have spoken quietly of the little nothings that attend a life bent like his, of the way he touched the plank when the logs were floated down the river in floods not by sight, but by a humming in the timbers, of the way he pulled his fingers back when a nail head in a stair warmed underfoot without showing a shine. She would have mentioned the jar only if pressed, and then she would have done so in terms of the hospital's thrift, that a boy's tooth must be kept because, though it cannot be rejoined to him, it belongs to the story of his body as surely as the scar on his forearm does, and anything that belongs to a body must be held in witness when that body cannot hold it itself. There were no miracles, and would be none. There was only the steady assertion of matter under a kind of distress that the 19th century, bent on order and requiring order, could not give a clean name to. There is a last image from that period that the people who were there came back to when news from the outside later made everything that had been small seem improperly insignificant. It was a morning of hard frost, when the panes in the east wing took the day slowly and made a white veil of it, and the breath of every soul condensed and fell like the smallest of rains back upon their own collars. The window in the boys' room made its patterns with the usual ferns and feathers, and then, on one pane alone, drew out something more spare, measured lengths and pauses that a man who knew the key would have seen as dashes and dots, and that anyone else would have called the fancy of ice. The boy's chest rose and fell under a blanket rubbed thin at the corners and smelling of iron and soap and the almond reek of spirits long remembered by cloth, and his lips moved once without sound, as if he had taken a sip that needed swallowing. On the shelf in the back room, the jar made its small contribution to the day's music by being glass among glass, and when someone passed too close, the faint thread under its new hardness began again and ran as long as the air altered around. It stopped when the space went back to its ordinary invisible density. In the corridor, a bent square nail that had held a chair rail in place since before the boy's mother was born had been drawing itself out of its timber by a measure, so gradual that only the early nurse with a way of noticing would have seen it. That morning, with a little, almost apologetic sound, no louder than a teaspoon placed on a saucer, it fell. The nail came to rest on its side against the baseboard, its dull face catching the smallest prickle of light, and the boy opened his eyes where he lay, not startled, not soothed, only as if he had been waiting for a necessary thing to move, and it had at last done so. The daylight under the door quivered just perceptibly as someone passed down the hall, and the board that had once held the nail accepted the smallest expansion of itself without creak or complaint, the way a person will adjust the slope of a shoulder to accept a weight that the house has asked him to carry a little longer.